into a little bit more detail about prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are derived from phospholipids in the inner leaflet of the cell membrane, and for example, like phosphatidylserine. And these are metabolized by different enzymes, but particularly by cyclooxygenases, known as COX-1 and COX-2. And this forms the actual lipid prostaglandin molecule. This biosynthesis is also increased in inflamed tissues. So areas with tissue damage or infection, you'll have a higher production of prostaglandins. And as you guys may have heard previously, prostaglandins and other related molecules can be blocked by certain medications known as NSAIDs, or nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, such as ibuprofen. And these drugs usually either inhibit COX-1, COX-2, or both of these enzymes. So prostaglandins can have a variety of effects. Prostaglandin 1 and 2 can both cause vasodilation. And prostaglandin 2 is a hyperalgesic, which means that it increases the sensitivity to a pain response. And it also helps induce a fever response as well. So here's an example of these mediators in action. So here we have, for example, a macrophage that comes into contact with a signal suggesting that inflammation is occurring. This macrophage will then release a variety of different signals. In this case, we have mostly examples of cytokines, and these include such things such as IL-1 beta, TNF-alpha, IL-6, and those will all induce an inflammatory response. For example, IL-6 will help activate lymphocytes and increase antibody production. It can also systemically induce a fever, as well as an acute phase protein production. And we'll see in a little bit some more examples of an acute response, but these inflammatory cytokines are very important for mediating and initiating that response. In our example of the homeostatic diagram, these cytokines are the signal from the sensor to the effector. So an acute inflammatory response is most well known as being characterized by several symptoms, including redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And this is what you might see if you get a cut or you have an infection in a specific area. And these are caused by increased vascular permeability, allowing fluid to enter the area, as well as the influx of immune cells such as neutrophils and monocytes. This response is typically resolved quickly, and it resolves quickly once the initiating factor is removed. So once that infection, for example, is cleared, then the tissue can return to the repair stage to return to its initial state. It can also occur at the expense of other functions. So, for example, the vascular permeability and swelling helps bring immune cells to that area. However, it diverts other factors in the blood from different parts of the body. So you have an initial response in that area, but you might have to focus less on other things such as digestion in order to address the inflammatory response, which is more pressing. And this will return the regulated variable to its normal range. And an analogy for this is a thermostat. So for example, if you set your thermostat to a specific temperature, then if it gets colder than that temperature, that change is sensed, and the thermostat will lead the heater to produce more heat and raise the temperature back to its set point. So this is an example of acute inflammation where there is a deviation from homeostasis Then there are signals that help resolve that deviation, and the state is returned to its original homeostatic point. So cytokines are very important for this acute phase response. So we mentioned a few earlier when talking about the cytokines released by macrophages. These are a few other examples. So here we have our canonical inflammatory cytokines, IL-1 beta, IL-6, and TNF-alpha. And in this figure, it's figure 3.33, you can see all the different targets that these cytokines have. So for example, they can act on the hypothalamus and induce an increase in body temperature. They can also help mobilize neutrophils from the blood or mobilize energy to that area to allow for increased inflammation. So then what is a chronic inflammatory response? So this is much less discussed in the context of an infection, because usually you can clear that infection and return to a healthy state. Chronic inflammation, however, occurs when you cannot clear that initiating signal. And it is a shift in the set point. So this, like I said, is when the inflammatory stimulus cannot be removed, so it must be adapted to. And in our thermostat analogy, if the room gets cold and for some reason the thermostat cannot bring it back to the temperature it's set at, you might have to adapt to that colder temperature. For example, you could put on a coat. So this isn't changing the temperature in the room, it's just helping you to live within that change. And the acute response can be beneficial, but the chronic inflammatory response is often pathogenic. And we also have a situation known as para-inflammation or nearly inflammation, where this is chronic low-grade inflammatory response, often induced by tissue malfunction, and this contributes to pathology of different diseases. So now we'll return to our diagram of that homeostatic circuit. So we can see here we have a value of a set point that is controlled by something like the thermostat, which then sends signals to your heater to produce heat and return that variable to what it is set to. And here again we have our example with insulin. And you can also think of this as having a controller of the pancreas with multiple signals that go either to increase blood glucose or decrease blood glucose. And these would be all examples of an acute response. In a chronic response, what would actually change is not the variable here, but it would be the conditions which the rest of the body functions within that new setting. So there are many examples of inflammatory diseases. This is just a chart summarizing a few from different systems of the body, but we're going to be talking about a few specific examples. In particular, gout, type 2 diabetes, and chronic fatigue syndrome, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, which I'll be calling CFS. So our first example is gout. Gout is when uric acid crystals form and are deposited into the joints. These large crystals are then detected by macrophages, which induce an inflammatory response in an attempt to remove them. However, often these crystals are too large to be removed by the macrophages, and so you have a continuing influx of inflammatory cytokines from those macrophages as they try to recruit more and more cells to the area to eliminate those crystals. So these uric acid crystals, which you can see an example of here, this arrow is pointing to, will induce a large influx of immune cells shown in the right-hand arrow. And this can also lead to what is called the Nlrp3 Inflammasome. So the inflammasome is a very important intercellular aspect of inflammation. and it helps regulate the release of inflammatory cytokines, particularly IL-1 beta. So it also regulates the activation of caspase-1, which can cleave different proteins, releasing those inflammatory cytokines. And it's linked to many different inflammatory diseases, including neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. It's often initiated through TLR signaling, and it can also then lead to very rapid induction of inflammation because those inflammatory precursors are already formed, so they only need to be cleaved and then released. You don't have to start at the transcription and translation steps. So now we have an example here. You don't need to memorize the details of this activation pathway, but I just wanted to point out a few aspects of it. So here we have the induction through TLL4 of inflammation, which can proceed through the NF-kappa B pathway to induce the transcription and translation of various inflammatory genes. However, in addition, this pathway can then lead to the cleavage of pre-existing molecules, in this case procaspase, which is cleaved and then forms this wheel or star-like structure of caspase-1. And this can then help cleave the pre-IL-1 beta to IL-1 beta to be quickly released into the body. Type 2 diabetes is another example of a chronic inflammatory disease, and this response results in decreased insulin sensitivity, which is characterized by high levels of TNFs or inflammatory cytokines, as well as interleukins and cytokines known as adipokines, which are produced by the adipose tissue. So in acute inflammation, as we discussed in the diagram, changes in insulin will direct glucose where it's needed. So the reason that you might want this beneficial altering of insulin sensitivity in the short term is to help direct glucose perhaps to areas of an infection, so the immune cells there have enough glucose and energy to fight off that infection. However, when this is chronic, it leads to insulin resistance. So we have that set point of blood glucose. However, when this cannot be changed, this altering of insulin sensitivity by skeletal muscle continues for a long period of time. This leads to systemic insulin resistance. And this can also induce the inflammasome, which again leads to a positive feedback mechanism of release of additional inflammatory cytokines. So finally, we'll talk about chronic fatigue syndrome. So this is a disease that's characterized by a cluster of symptoms, primarily severe fatigue, as well as confusion, memory problems, sleep disturbances, and musculoskeletal pain. And for a very long time, it was thought that this was not a disease of physiologic origin because you don't see changes in many of the laboratory tests that might be run on a patient. However, with further research, it's been realized that chronic fatigue actually results from a state of chronic inflammation. So these patients can show impaired NK cell and CD8 cytotoxic T cell function, as well as autoantibodies against antigens in the nervous system, and high cytokine levels, which again indicate that increased inflammatory state. This can also lead to dysbiosis of the gut microbiome and increased gut permeability, and it may possibly be triggered or sustained by an infection, although it doesn't seem that one infectious agent is the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome. So many of these symptoms are what are known as sickness behaviors. So sickness behaviors are things that might occur when you have an infection, such as the flu. So when you have the flu, you feel sick, you're very tired, you have a fever, you won't want to go out and do anything. And these sickness behaviors are beneficial for the immune system because it helps give a boost to those immune cells fighting off the infection. However, in a state of chronic inflammation, the signals saying that there's an infection or a problem going on are continuing for long periods of time, and this leads to a sustained sickness behavior response, which helps account for many of the symptoms seen in CFS. So one interesting thing that we can take away by using this disease as an example, that besides the physiological roles in maintaining tissue homeostasis, inflammation can also have an effect on behavior. So it can interact with the nervous system and cause these behaviors of fatigue. And this helps explain why many diseases of chronic inflammation, such as type 2 diabetes, often involve severe fatigue and related behaviors in patients. So in summary, to tie some of this all together, we've seen that inflammation in the context of infection is the most well-studied example. And you guys talked about this in more detail with Chapter 3 in the innate immune system. But inflammation really occurs to return a tissue to homeostasis. So it's not necessarily solely a response against an infectious agent. Instead, it helps return the tissue, whether it's been damaged or is under stress, to that original healthy homeostatic state. Acute inflammation, which we talked about, helps return those variables to the set point. So this is our example of the thermostat inducing the heater to increase the temperature. However, chronic inflammation changes the set point. So this is when you maybe can't change the temperature, and so you must adapt to the now colder temperature in the room, and do this by putting on a coat. And so you can see this in many of our chronic inflammatory disease examples because there are changes in homeostasis in the body. And this is the body trying to adapt its inflammatory response when it cannot change the variable back to its original level. Many diseases involve chronic or systemic inflammation. We talked about a few examples. And we also saw some examples of how inflammation can have impacts on behavior and metabolism. So in summary, today we discussed what is inflammation, and I hope I've given you guys an initial idea of some examples of inflammation. Some of these examples if you're interested. We've also talked about the canonical inflammatory response to infection and the inflammatory mediators that are important for this response. Then we discussed the differences between acute and chronic inflammation and how the body either changes or adapts to alterations in homeostasis. And then finally, we talked about a few examples of diseases of inflammation where I showed some ways that inflammatory states can lead to symptoms or outcomes of disease. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in the next lecture.